The words hit Virginia Dugan like a physical blow, stopping her dead in the middle of the dusty main street of Harrow Creek, Texas, on a scorching August afternoon in 1882. "You hate my papa," said the small voice beside her. She turned slowly, looking down at the boy who had spoken. Tommy Barker was 7 years old, with his father's dark eyes and a directness that could cut through stone. He was holding a paper bag of peppermint candies she had just bought him at the general store, and he was staring up at her with an expression that carried far more weight than any 7-year-old should be able to summon. "I do not hate your papa, Tommy," she said carefully. "You do," he insisted, and there was no malice in his voice, only a kind of quiet certainty that unnerved her completely. "I see how you look at him, like he did something wrong to you." Virginia opened her mouth to protest, but Tommy was not finished. "Papa fixed your roof," he said simply. "During the rain last month. The bad one. He was up there the whole night, and he made me stay inside, and he came back in the morning all soaked through, and he told me not to tell you. He said you would not want to know." The world seemed to tilt beneath Virginia's boots. She stared at the boy, and the entire architecture of her understanding of Albert Barker began to collapse around her in real time, brick by brick, wall by wall, until she was standing in the rubble of everything she had been so absolutely certain of. She thought she knew that man. She thought she had him perfectly measured. Cold, distant, arrogant. A man who looked through people rather than at them, who answered questions with the bare minimum of words, who had made it clear from the very first week she arrived in Harrow Creek that he considered her presence in his town a mild inconvenience at best and a threat to his carefully ordered world at worst. She had hated him for it. Not truly hated, perhaps, but something that wore hatred's clothing, something sharp and defensive that had kept her spine straight and her chin level every time she passed him on the street and received only the briefest nod in acknowledgement of her existence. And all that time, he had climbed onto her roof in a midnight storm and worked through the darkness to keep the rain out of her home, without telling her, without expecting anything in return. How long ago did this happen? She asked, and her voice came out strange, stripped of its usual composure. Tommy thought about it, counting on his fingers with the focused seriousness of a child doing important arithmetic. It was the big storm. The one that broke Mr. Kellner's fence and flooded the creek. "Papa said your roof had been bad for a while, and when the storm came he could see from our place that you had buckets out, and the whole thing was going to give in." Virginia remembered that storm with perfect clarity. She had spent that entire night moving buckets around her small house, placing them under the worst of the leaks, listening to the thunder crack across the Texas sky, and calculating how many more bad storms the house could withstand before the ceiling simply gave way. When she had woken in the morning, exhausted and dispirited, and climbed up to look at the damage in the gray dawn light, she had been astonished to find the worst sections repaired. New shingles, fresh tar around the chimney base, the work of someone who knew what they were doing. She had assumed it was the landlord, old Marcus Webb, who owned the property she rented. She had actually sent him a letter of thanks. He had written back in his cramped, elderly hand saying he was pleased she found the place satisfactory and that he would see about getting it properly inspected in the spring. He had not done it. Albert Barker had done it. Albert Barker, who looked at her like she was a complication he had not asked for. Albert Barker, who had not spoken more than 30 consecutive words to her in the 4 months she had been living in Harrow Creek. Albert Barker, who had made her feel, in the particular way that cold and silent men make women feel, that she was somehow insufficient, somehow unworthy of the basic warmth of human engagement. That Albert Barker had spent an entire rainy night on her roof. Virginia looked down at Tommy, who was eating a peppermint candy now with an expression of mild satisfaction, apparently unaware that he had just detonated something significant inside her chest. "Why did he tell you not to tell me?" she asked. Tommy shrugged with the particular eloquence of small children. "He said some people do not like to feel like they need help. He said you seemed like one of those people." Virginia Dugan had arrived in Harrow Creek, Texas, on a bright April morning in 1882, stepping off the stage from San Antonio with a single large trunk, a carpet bag, a box of books, and the quiet, determined energy of a woman who had decided to build something from nothing and was prepared to work for it. She was 31 years old, which in 1882 was old enough that the women of Harrow Creek looked at her with a particular mixture of sympathy and curiosity. She was unmarried, which compounded their interest. She was educated, which complicated it further. And she had arrived to take over the town's small schoolhouse, which the community had been without for the better part of 2 years since the previous teacher, a young man named Fletcher, had left to join a cattle drive and never returned. The town needed her. She understood that. What she had not entirely anticipated was the degree to which a town could need something and still make the person providing it feel like an outsider. Harrow Creek was not an unkind place. It had a population of roughly 300 people, a main street with a general store, a hardware store, a saloon, a church, a doctor's office, and a small bank. It had good water from the nearby creek that gave the town its name, and it sat in a valley between two low ridges that broke the worst of the wind in winter. The soil around it was fair cattle country, and the ranchers who worked the land around the town formed the backbone of its economy and its social life. She had been welcomed by the school board with genuine relief and warm handshakes. Mrs. Patricia Holt, the preacher's wife, had brought her a pie on her first day and stayed to help her unpack. The general store's owner, a cheerful round man named Samuel Oakes, had given her a discount on her first purchases and told her she was doing the Lord's work by coming to teach the children. It was Albert Barker who had made her feel from the very first moment that she did not quite belong. She had met him on her second day in town. She had been walking from her rented house to the schoolhouse, which stood at the eastern edge of town near a stand of cottonwood trees, and he had been coming the other way with a boy in tow, a small dark-eyed child who she would later learn was Tommy. Albert Barker was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with the particular leanness of someone who worked physically every day of his life. He had a face that the sun had marked deeply, dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, and eyes the color of good coffee that did not seem to warm when they looked at you. He had nodded at her, a single brief nod, and he had walked past. She had found out later that he owned the largest ranch in the area, the Barker Spread, some 3,000 acres to the north of town. She had found out that he had a son and no wife, that his wife had died 4 years ago, and that he had raised Tommy alone since then. She had found out that he was respected, and that people called him reliable and fair, though never particularly warm, and that he did not come to town more than 2 or 3 times a week, and spent the rest of his time working his land with the focus of a man who had decided that work was the only thing worth doing. What she had also found out, through the gradual accumulation of small social moments that constitute the education of an outsider in a new community, was that Albert Barker did not approve of her. She was not entirely certain why. She had pieced together a theory over her first weeks in town, assembled from fragments of conversation and overheard remarks, and the particular way certain people fell slightly quiet when she entered a room. Albert Barker had apparently been one of the school board members who had reviewed the candidates for the teaching position. He had apparently argued in favor of a male candidate, a younger man from Austin who had also applied. He had been overruled by the majority of the board, who had found Virginia's references and qualifications more impressive. And he had apparently accepted this outcome with the stoic dignity of a man who disagreed but respected the democratic process, which meant he had never said another word against her. He had simply looked at her, whenever their paths crossed, with those flat, unrevealing eyes and nodded and walked on. Virginia had told herself it did not matter. She was there to teach children, not to win popularity contests among ranchers who thought women belonged at home. She was good at her work. The children responded to her with enthusiasm. Within her first 2 months, she had reorganized the schoolhouse, established proper reading groups by ability level, introduced arithmetic games that made the older children competitive and the younger ones eager, and begun a small lending library using her own books. The parents noticed. She received compliments at church on Sundays, invitations to dinner at the families of her students, small gifts of produce and preserves left on her doorstep. The town warmed to her in the gradual, cumulative way that small towns warm to useful and decent people. Albert Barker remained cold, not cruel, not hostile, simply cold. She had begun to take it personally in a way she knew was unproductive. She had begun to feel, every time he passed her on the street with that minimal nod, a flash of something hot and indignant in her chest, a desire to stop him and demand to know what precisely she had done to deserve his consistent indifference. She had done no such thing, of course. She was a professional woman in a professional role, and she managed her feelings with the discipline that her life had required of her. But the feelings were there, real and persistent, and they had shaped her understanding of Albert Barker into something angular and uncharitable. And now Tommy was telling her that his father had spent an entire storm-soaked night on her roof. She walked home slowly that afternoon, her mind working at the new information the way her tongue might work at a loosened tooth, worrying at it, unable to leave it alone. Tommy had gone back to his father's ranch with a peppermint candy still tucked in his cheek, apparently unconcerned by what he had revealed. He was a trusting child, not calculating. He had not told her in order to manipulate her feelings. He had told her because he was 7 years old and he thought she deserved to know that his papa had done something kind. Because the idea that she thought poorly of his father bothered him in the simple, uncomplicated way that children are bothered by injustice. That simple, uncomplicated honesty was what made it impossible to dismiss. Virginia sat on her front porch in the long golden light of late afternoon, looking at the repaired section of her roof from below. She could see it now that she was looking for it. The new shingles were slightly lighter in color than the old ones, not dramatically so, but enough that someone paying attention could see where old material ended and new began. Someone had done careful work. Someone had matched the pitch of the roof properly and set the shingles with professional precision. She thought about Albert Barker in the rain. She tried to construct the image and found that it arrived with a strange emotional charge. That tall, broad-shouldered, controlled man climbing onto a neighbor's roof in the middle of a thunderstorm, working in the dark and the wet, making sure she would be dry and safe, and then deliberately choosing not to tell her. Choosing not to accept thanks, not to create an obligation, not to leverage the kindness into any form of social currency. Why? What did it mean? She wanted to dismiss it as guilt, as a man trying to compensate for his quiet unfairness toward her by performing an anonymous act of goodwill. But that felt wrong. It felt too small and too cynical for what Tommy had described. Tommy had spoken about it as if it were simply something his father did, not a grand gesture but a natural response to a neighbor's need. She thought about what Tommy had said. He said you seemed like one of those people who did not like to feel like they needed help. Albert Barker had looked at her, had understood something about her, and had acted on that understanding while respecting the boundary it implied. He had helped her in a way that protected her sense of independence. He had done it in the dark, in the rain, alone, and then he had returned to his life and let her keep her dignity intact. That was not the act of a cold man. That was the act of a man who paid attention. Virginia Dugan had come to Harrow Creek carrying a particular history. She had been born in Virginia, which was where her name came from, the only child of parents who had been both loving and financially precarious, moving from town to town throughout her childhood as her father chased employment with the particular optimistic desperation of a man who was better at dreaming than at doing. She had learned early to be capable and self-sufficient because the alternative was to be a burden, and she had internalized the lesson so thoroughly that it had become her identity. She was capable. She managed. She did not require assistance. She had been engaged once, at 23, to a man named Charles Whitfield, who had seemed steady and kind, and who had turned out to be neither. He had been the kind of man who appreciated capable women in theory and found them threatening in practice, who wanted a partner who could run a household efficiently and simultaneously defer to his judgment on everything that mattered. When Virginia had declined this arrangement, politely at first and then with increasing clarity, Charles Whitfield had found himself a more accommodating woman within 6 months and had married her with evident relief. Virginia had not been broken by this. She had been, if anything, clarified by it. She had continued her education, had trained as a teacher, had taught in 2 towns before Harrow Creek and built a solid professional reputation. She had friends, genuine ones, and a life that she found meaningful and interesting most of the time. But she had also, in ways she did not always acknowledge even to herself, built walls that were perhaps slightly higher than they needed to be. And men, in her experience, either did not notice the walls, which revealed a lack of perception she found disqualifying, or they noticed them and withdrew, which revealed a lack of persistence she found equally disqualifying. She had never met a man who noticed the walls, understood why they were there, and quietly decided to help from outside them without making her feel like a project. Albert Barker, it seemed, might be that man. The thought was terrifying. She went inside and made herself supper, moving around her small kitchen with practiced efficiency, and she told herself she was not going to do anything precipitous. She was not going to march up to Albert Barker's ranch and accuse him of secret kindness. She was not going to alter her behavior around him dramatically, which would signal to him that Tommy had talked and would put the boy in an uncomfortable position. She was simply going to pay closer attention. She was going to look at Albert Barker with fresh eyes and see what there was to see. What she saw, over the 2 weeks that followed, rearranged her world entirely. She saw him at the Saturday market, where the local ranchers and farmers brought produce and goods to sell. She had been there before and had observed him as a distant figure, exchanging brief words with men, accepting small transactions with nods and handshakes. Now she watched with different eyes, and she saw how he stopped to speak with old Henry Marsh, who was 81 and whose hands shook badly with age, and how he helped Henry pack his unsold goods back into his wagon with a matter-of-fact ease that asked nothing in return. She saw how he paused at the edge of the market, where a group of children were playing too close to the horses tied at the rail, and without raising his voice, he simply repositioned himself in a way that created a natural barrier between the children and the restless horses, keeping them safe without disrupting anyone's fun. She saw him stop in front of the school one afternoon when a shutter had come loose in the wind and was banging against the building. He was passing on his way to the hardware store. She had been inside and heard the commotion and come to the window to look, and she had watched him pause, assess the problem, retrieve a small tool from his pocket, and fix the shutter in under 3 minutes. He had then simply continued on his way. He had not looked at the window. He had not known she was watching. She saw him with Tommy, which was perhaps the most significant thing she saw. She taught Tommy Barker, and she had always known he was a remarkable child, perceptive and eager, and possessed of an emotional intelligence that was unusual in children his age. She had attributed this to some innate quality, some natural temperament. Now she understood that it was also a product of parenting. She had begun to look for the invisible shaping hand in Tommy's character, and she found it in the way Tommy listened when adults spoke to him, truly listened rather than simply waiting for his turn, which was Albert Barker's way. She found it in the way Tommy was careful with the smaller children at school, protecting them from the rougher play of the older ones with a quiet, undemonstrative firmness that was entirely his father's technique in miniature. Albert Barker was not cold. He was contained. There was a difference, and she had been too quick and too hurt to see it. She was working up her courage to do something she had never done before, which was to approach a man she had misjudged and find a way to let him know it, when circumstances accelerated her timeline considerably. It was a Friday in September, 3 weeks after Tommy's revelation, and Virginia had kept the older children after school to work on a mathematics problem that they were going to present at the upcoming Harvest Social, a celebration the town held each year at the end of the harvest season. The social was in 10 days, and the children were going to demonstrate practical applications of arithmetic to the gathered community, measuring, calculating costs and profits, the kind of mathematics that had genuine utility in a ranching and farming community. She had stayed late herself after the children left, reorganizing her materials and preparing the following week's lessons, and she had not paid attention to the time. When she finally looked up from her work, the light through the schoolhouse windows had gone from gold to deep orange to the blue-gray of early evening, and she realized with a start that she had been working for nearly 3 hours past the end of the school day. She packed her bag and stepped outside into the cooling evening air and nearly collided with Albert Barker. He was standing on the small porch of the schoolhouse, and the collision was not quite a collision because he stepped back and caught her arm with one hand to prevent her from stumbling, and for a single electric moment, they were much closer to each other than they had ever been. She could see the grain of the leather in his vest, could smell the particular outdoor scent of him, dust and horses and something like cedar, and then he released her arm and stepped back, and she stepped back, and they were at proper distance again. "Miss Dugan," he said. His voice was low and even, and it carried, she realized for the first time, a quality she had never heard in it before because she had never before been close enough. It was careful, deliberately careful, as if he were selecting each word with precision. "Mr. Barker," she said, "I did not see you." "Tommy forgot his reader," he said, holding up the small blue-covered book that Tommy used for his reading lessons. "He left it here." "Ah," she looked at the book and then at him and then at the book again. "I saw it on the desk, but I did not know whose it was. I would have come earlier, but I was occupied at the ranch." Of course, she should have left it at that. She should have said good evening and walked home and continued her careful strategy of quiet observation. Instead, something inside her that had been building for 3 weeks and probably much longer made a decision before she consciously endorsed it. "Mr. Barker," she said, "I wonder if I might ask you something." He looked at her, those dark eyes unreadable, attentive. "You may." "The south section of my roof," she said carefully. "The new shingles." I had assumed it was Mr. Webb, the landlord, who arranged for the repairs after the storm in August, but I have recently come to understand that it was not Mr. Webb. Something happened in his face. It was not dramatic. It was barely visible. A slight tension in the jaw, a fractional change in the set of his mouth. His eyes did not waver, but something behind them shifted. "The shingles were pulling loose," he said. "In a storm like that one, you would have lost a significant section of roof." "You climbed up there in the dark," she said. "In the rain." He said nothing. "You spent the whole night," she said. "It needed doing." She looked at him and felt something large and somewhat frightening moving through her chest. "Why did you not tell me?" The silence that followed was several seconds long, which in a conversation between two people who had barely spoken to each other in 4 months was an eternity. "You did not need to know," he said at last. "Most people would consider that courtesy at minimum, an explanation of who repaired their property." "I am not most people," he said, and it was not arrogance in his voice when he said it. It was just a statement of fact, delivered without apology or self-congratulation. Virginia stood in the cooling September air outside the schoolhouse and looked at Albert Barker and understood suddenly, with the particular clarity that arrives only when you finally let yourself see something you have been refusing to look at directly, that she was in serious trouble. Not the dangerous kind of trouble, the other kind. The kind where your heart is already several steps ahead of your careful, self-protective mind, and catching it is going to require you to decide whether catching it is even something you want to do. "Would you like to walk with me?" she said. "It is a pleasant evening." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at Tommy's reader in his hand, and then at the road toward his ranch and then back at her. "Yes," he said. "All right." They walked together through the main street of Harrow Creek in the blue September evening, and they talked. It was not easy at first. It was the conversation of two people who had been at a certain formal distance from each other for long enough that closing the distance required an initial awkwardness, a period of calibrating what tone to use, how much to reveal, how directly to speak. She asked him about his ranch, and he answered in the brief, factual way she had come to expect, and she pushed gently past the brevity by asking follow-up questions that required slightly longer answers, and gradually the answers grew longer. He ran cattle, primarily. He had inherited the ranch from his father and had expanded it over 15 years to its current size. He employed 4 hands year-round and took on additional labor during the cattle drives and the haying season. He was in the process of fencing his southern pasture, which was a significant investment of both money and time. He had opinions about fencing, which she found unexpectedly interesting because they were practical opinions connected to a deep understanding of how land worked and how cattle behaved, and she listened with genuine attention. He asked her, tentatively, about her teaching, about what it was like to manage the school. She told him about the individual children, their different personalities and learning styles, and she watched something happen in his face when she described Tommy, a relaxation, a softening, the particular face of a parent hearing good things about their child. She told him about the harvest social presentation, and his eyebrows went up slightly in what she was learning to read as his version of impressed surprise. "They came up with the idea themselves," she said. "Well, partly. I suggested we do something for the social, and Emily Marsh suggested the mathematics demonstration, because she had heard her father say he wished he had been better at arithmetic when he was young. The children ran with it from there. Emily Marsh, he said, she is 8 years old. She is extraordinarily sharp, Virginia said. All of your observations about her were right. He looked at her sharply. I did not think I had shared observations about Emily Marsh with you. You did not, she said. But I heard, through Mrs. Holt, that you had mentioned to the school board last spring that the Marsh girl had unusual ability, and that it would be a shame if the school were not filled with a teacher who could meet her where she was. He was quiet for a moment. I did not realize Mrs. Holt had discussed that. I do not think she shared it as gossip, Virginia said. I think she mentioned it because it speaks well of you, and she knew I had formed an impression of you that was perhaps not entirely charitable. Another silence. They had reached the end of the main street and turned without discussion onto the road that led back toward her rented house, following the most natural path without either of them having suggested it explicitly. What impression had you formed? He asked, and his voice was careful. That you disapproved of me, she said honestly. That you found my presence here an inconvenience. That you were, perhaps, the kind of man who believed women had their proper place, and that this particular woman was out of it. He was quiet for longer this time. The cottonwood trees along the road made soft sounds in the evening breeze, and somewhere a nightjar was beginning its call in the dusk. I owe you an explanation, he said. You do not owe me anything. I behaved badly, he said, and the directness of it, delivered without flinching, without excuse, stopped her breath for a moment. Not in the way you think. I did not believe and do not believe that women have no place outside the home. My wife was one of the most capable people I have ever known, and she could run circles around most men in this territory. I voted against your appointment because I was afraid. Virginia turned to look at him. He was looking straight ahead at the road, his face set in its habitual contained expression, but there was something behind it now, something effortful about the containment. Afraid of what? She said quietly. Tommy, he said. He had been struggling after his mother died. He had a teacher for part of the year after, a young man, perfectly adequate, and then no teacher at all, and in that time he had retreated into himself in a way that worried me. I did not want him to form an attachment to another teacher who might leave. The man I favored for the position had roots here, family in the area, less likely to move on. Virginia absorbed this. And I was a woman from elsewhere with no ties to the community, she said slowly, more likely to leave. Or to marry, he said, and leave teaching as women do. That is a reasonable fear, she said, poorly expressed, I grant you, but I understand the logic. The expression was poor, he agreed. I should not have let it stand as cold silence. That was not fair to you. No, she said, it was not. You turned out to be precisely the right teacher for Tommy, he said. He has been a different child since September, more open, more willing to be a child, if that makes sense, less like a small adult carrying too much weight. The tenderness in his voice when he spoke of Tommy was something Virginia had not allowed herself to hear clearly before. She heard it now. It was enormous. It was the whole shape of the man, really, contained in the way he spoke about his son. They had arrived at the gate of her rented house. They stopped. The evening had deepened to full dusk, and the stars were beginning to appear, brilliant and thick in the Texas sky, the way they never were in the town she had come from, where other lights competed. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. "Thank you for asking," he said, and there was something slightly raw in it, as if the politeness were also true. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture she had seen him make 100 times to a dozen different people, and yet it landed differently now. Then he turned and walked back toward his ranch, and Virginia stood at her gate and watched him go and felt the complicated, terrifying, quietly luminous feeling of someone standing at the beginning of something real. She saw him twice the following week, brief encounters on the street where the dynamic between them had shifted almost imperceptibly and probably invisibly to everyone else, but not to her and not, she thought, to him. There was a quality of attention in his nods now, a slight pause before he walked on that had not been there before. She found herself looking forward to those moments with a persistence that she recognized as significant. It was Tommy who accelerated things next, as Tommy tended to do, with the guileless effectiveness of a child who saw clearly what adults were complicating. He stayed after school on Wednesday to help her clean the blackboard, a task he had appointed himself to 2 weeks ago for reasons he had not explained, but which Virginia suspected were connected to the revelation in the street and some private mission of his own. While he worked, he talked in the rambling, associative way of children, moving from topic to topic without apparent logic, but always, she noticed, arriving eventually at some point he wanted to make. That Wednesday, the path led through a description of what he had eaten for breakfast, then through a description of a hawk he had seen near the creek, then through a general meditation on whether hawks were brave or just hungry, to the following statement. "Papa made Sunday roast last week, and he made too much, and he said he did not know what to do with the rest of it, and I said you should bring some to Miss Dugan, and he said he did not think you would want that, and I said I thought you probably would." Virginia set down the chalk she was holding. "What did he say to that?" "Said I was probably right," Tommy said, continuing to clean the blackboard with complete composure, "but that it was complicated." "Did he say why it was complicated?" Tommy considered. "No, but I think I know why." "Why?" He turned and looked at her with those dark eyes that were so much like his father's. "Because he likes you," he said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has simply observed something real. "And when you like someone and you are a grown-up, it is always complicated. I do not know why grown-ups make it complicated, but they always do." Virginia laughed, which surprised her, and then she pressed her hand over her mouth because the laugh had come from somewhere very deep and real, and she was not quite prepared for it. Tommy watched her with an expression of benign curiosity. "Your father is a wise man," she said when she had recovered. "He is," Tommy agreed. "But he also makes things more complicated than they need to be sometimes. He said so himself. He said that is one of the things he is working on. He said that. He says it a lot, actually. He talks to me," Tommy added, as if this were something to be noted, "about things that are on his mind. He said once that I am his best company." A pause. "I do not always understand everything he says, but I like that he says it." Virginia thought about a man talking to his 7-year-old son about the things weighing on his mind. not because the child could solve them, but because the talking itself mattered, because connection mattered, because Albert Barker had apparently decided that what his son needed most after losing his mother was a father who was present and honest and genuinely there, even when the things on his mind were beyond a child's understanding. That was a different man from the one she had invented. It was a better man. She invited Albert Barker to the Harvest Social Dinner, which was the event in 10 days, on Thursday morning. She did it by the simple mechanism of stopping him on the main street when their paths crossed, and she noted with private satisfaction that he looked briefly startled, which was the most visible expression of surprise she had yet observed in him. The school board members are expected to come to the children's mathematics presentation, she said, keeping her voice pleasant and professional. As a board member, your presence would be appropriate. Afterward, if you and Tommy would care to join the dinner, I would be very glad of the company. He looked at her. Tommy will be there for the presentation. Yes, and afterward there will be dancing and supper. Tommy likes dancing, I believe. He does, Albert said, and there was the ghost of something at the corner of his mouth that she was beginning to understand was his smile, the thing he felt but kept contained. Then I hope you will both come, she said, and perhaps we might save the third dance. His eyes met hers with a directness that sent warmth climbing up through her chest. I will see to it, he said. The Harvest Social was held in the large barn that Samuel Oakes had built for the purpose at the north edge of town, strung with lanterns and decorated with dried corn and the last of the season's flowers. The community turned out in force, as it did for the social every year, dressed in their best and carrying their best behavior, the particular magic of a small community gathering that transforms everyday neighbors into something slightly ceremonial and wonderful. The children's mathematics presentation was a genuine triumph, and Virginia watched from the side with pride swelling in her chest, as Tommy Barker explained to the assembled adults how to calculate the profit on a cattle sale using nothing but a blackboard and a piece of chalk, demonstrating the arithmetic with a calm clarity that made several of the ranchers in the audience lean forward with actual interest. Emily Marsh had organized the group with a natural authority that made everyone smile, and even the youngest children, who were contributing simple addition demonstrations, carried themselves with the serious pride of people doing important work. She found Albert Barker in the crowd during the applause. He was standing near the barn wall, slightly apart from the group as was his way, and he was watching Tommy with an expression that was, in the context of his normal containment, extraordinarily open. It was love, plain and undisguised, the love of a father for his child, and it was so unguarded that Virginia felt as if she were seeing something private, something he had not intended to reveal in public. Then he looked up and found her watching him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the crowded barn while the applause continued around them. And the heat that moved between that look was something Virginia was quite certain could be felt on both sides. The music started an hour later, after the supper, a fiddle player and a man with a guitar, and a woman who played the upright piano that had been brought from the church for the occasion. The dancing began informally, families moving onto the cleared center of the barn floor in various combinations, children dancing with parents and with each other, couples turning in easy circles. Albert Barker appeared at her side between the second and third dances with a composure that she suspected required more effort than he was displaying. "You mentioned the third dance," he said. "I did," she said. He offered his hand. She took it. She was not prepared for how it felt to dance with Albert Barker. She had danced with men before, plenty of times, at social occasions in the town she had lived in, and she had found it pleasant enough, a social formality with a physical dimension. This was not that. This was a man who moved with the same economy and certainty that he did everything else, who held her with a firm, appropriate propriety, and guided her through the movements of the dance with a quiet competence that somehow made her feel both directed and respected at the same time. "You are a good dancer," she said, slightly surprised. "My wife taught me," he said, and the sentence carried the particular weight of mention of the dead, a truth delivered simply because it was true and not because it was a point of pain or an emotional bid for anything. He had mentioned her, and the mention was clean. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Virginia said. "She was," he said. "She would have liked you, I think. She admired women who knew their own minds." Virginia felt tears threaten, which was startling and inconvenient. She managed them. "That is a kind thing to say." "It is a true thing," he said. They danced through the third song and into the fourth without separating, because neither of them moved to end it, and the music continued. And somewhere behind her she heard Tommy's delighted voice as he attempted a dance with Emily Marsh, and the sound of the children's laughter mixed with the music and the lamplight and the warm hay-scented air of the barn. And Virginia Dugan thought, "Here, this is it. This is what I came here for, though I did not know it." He walked her home after the social, with Tommy trotting alongside, half asleep on his feet and insisting he was not tired. The night was brilliant with stars, the kind of Texas September night that makes you feel the sky is closer than it has any right to be, and they walked the quiet street with Tommy between them. And at her gate, Tommy looked up at both of them with his perfectly perceptive dark eyes and said, with complete placidity, "I think I should like it if Miss Dugan came to the ranch sometime." "Tommy," Albert said, with a warning note that was mild enough to be mostly ceremonial. "I am just saying," Tommy said, and yawned enormously, and leaned against his father's side with the complete trust of a child who knows he is safe. Albert met Virginia's eyes over his son's head, and the helpless, tender, slightly mortified expression on his face was so human and so real that she laughed again, that deep surprised laugh, and he smiled. Truly smiled this time, not the ghost of it but the real thing, and it transformed his face so completely that she had to look away from the force of it. "Good night, Mr. Barker," she said. "Good night, Miss Dugan," he said. She had reached her door when he called after her quietly so only she could hear. "Virginia," she turned. "Next Sunday," he said. "If you would like to see the ranch, Tommy would like it. And so would I, then so would I," she said. She went inside and stood in her dark front room and pressed her hands against her cheeks, which were warm, and listened to the sound of her own heartbeat, which was very loud. She went to the Barker Ranch that Sunday, riding out in the mild October morning with the sky pale blue and the grass on either side of the road gone gold with autumn. Albert met her at the road's turn with a horse saddled and ready because he had assumed accurately that she rode, and Tommy appeared from behind a fence post like a small magician, having been hiding for some minutes in an ambush of welcome. The ranch was substantial and well run, which she had expected, but it was also something she had not expected. It was a home. Not simply a working property, not the bachelor establishment of a man going through the motions of domestic life, but a place that had been genuinely shaped by two people who had cared about it, and then by one person continuing to care in the absence of the other. The house was large, with a proper kitchen garden behind it that had not been allowed to go to wilderness even with summer's end, with a porch wide enough to sit on in the evening, and a view of the low hills to the north that, in October light, was heartbreakingly beautiful. Albert gave her a tour of the property with the quiet pride of a man who has built something real with his own hands and years, and she asked genuine questions about the cattle operation and the land management and the water situation, and his answers grew longer and more detailed as he realized her interest was not polite performance but genuine curiosity. Tommy rode his pony alongside them for part of it, contributing information and opinions with unself-conscious authority, and at some point in the middle of explaining the drainage system for the east pasture Albert looked sideways at her, and she looked sideways at him, and something passed between them that was warm and quiet and certain. Over the following weeks, things progressed with the deliberateness of two people who were both somewhat wary and both increasingly convinced. She went to the ranch on 2 more Sundays. He came to her house on a Tuesday evening to help reinforce the gate post that had been listing since a summer storm, a task that took approximately 40 minutes and was followed by coffee on the porch and a conversation about books, which revealed that Albert Barker was a reader, not widely or eclectically, but with depth, the same several books read and reread over years until they were part of how he thought. He had opinions about those books, strong ones. She argued with him about one interpretation, and he argued back with a focused intensity that was the most animated she had yet seen him. And when she finally conceded a point, he looked pleased in a way that was briefly, endearingly boyish. They had not yet said anything explicit. There was a particular kind of communication that exists between two reserved people who are falling in love, a language of proximity and attention and careful revelation, and they were speaking it fluently, but the words had not yet been said. The words arrived on a November afternoon, because life, in Virginia's experience, was rarely subtle about its timing. She had been walking out to collect firewood from the pile at the side of her house when she nearly stepped on the snake. It was a diamondback rattlesnake, and it was coiled between the woodpile and the house, and she stopped in time and stepped back in time and was entirely in no danger. But her heart was hammering like a telegraph at a disaster when Albert Barker came around the corner of the house a moment later, having heard nothing because there was nothing to hear, and found her standing very still and very pale and pointing at the woodpile. He dealt with the snake efficiently and without fuss, as she would have expected him to. And then he turned back to her and looked at her, and the expression on his face was not the contained, careful face she had come to know and read and appreciate. It was open. It was frightened, not at the snake, which was already dealt with, at the sight of her pale face, at the thought of what might have happened in the 2 seconds before he came around the corner. "Virginia," he said, and the way he said her name in that moment was entirely different from every other time he had said it. "I am perfectly fine," she said, which was true. "I know you are," he said, and he crossed the space between them without any further preliminary and took her face in both his hands and looked at her as if confirming the truth of it, as if her being fine was something that needed to be verified directly. And she looked back at him with her heart doing something very loud and definite. And he said, in a voice that was stripped of all its usual careful management, "I cannot continue to be a man who merely fixes things from a distance." She reached up and put her hands over his. "I am glad to hear it," she said. He kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss or a questioning one. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about it for a very long time and had finally found the moment and was not going to underperform it. She kissed him back in precisely the same spirit, and they stood beside her woodpile on a cold November afternoon in the Texas Hill Country and made a beginning that had been building for months. He spoke to her properly that evening, in the formal way that the era required, and that also, Virginia thought, suited him. He was not a man who could have done this casually. He sat across from her at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and he told her, with the careful precision of a man who did not say things he did not mean, that he had been drawn to her since the very first moment he saw her walk down the main street of Harrow Creek with her chin up and her spine straight, and that expression on her face that said she was going to build something here whether the town wanted her to or not, and that he had been so frightened of that attraction, so conscious of Tommy's fragility and of his own limited experience with a world that included feelings this large, that he had managed it badly and owed her a better beginning than the one he had given her. She told him in return that she had built walls and that she had been grateful for a man who had not tried to knock them down, but had simply done kind things quietly from the other side of them, until she had decided to open the gate herself. She told him that she understood now why he had voted against her appointment and that she did not hold it against him, because it had been done from love of his son, and because the outcome had proven him wrong and her right, and she was very comfortable with that. He laughed at this, the real laugh she had heard only a few times, low and genuine and warm. He told her he loved her before he left that night, standing at her gate in the November dark, holding her hand in both of his with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything. She told him she loved him too, and the relief on his face, that brief unguarded flood of relief as if he had been holding his breath, was perhaps the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They were engaged by Christmas, which gave the town of Harrow Creek something to discuss with great enthusiasm through the cold months of winter. Mrs. Patricia Holt declared herself unsurprised and immediately began organizing the community's response with the focused energy of a woman who considered human happiness a logistical problem to be properly managed. Samuel Oakes shook Albert's hand with the vigor of a man confirming a successful business transaction, and told Virginia she had made a very good choice. Tommy Barker, when told, looked at both of them with the particular expression of a child who has achieved a goal he set for himself through a combination of strategic revelation and social management, and said simply, "I know," and went back to eating his supper. The winter gave them months of courtship proper, which they had not had before the engagement, months of sitting together by fires and talking for long hours and learning each other in all the small ways that constitute true intimacy. She read to him some evenings, and he had opinions about the book she chose, strong opinions, delivered with the quiet force that characterized everything he said. He took her riding on Sundays through the dormant winter landscape of the hill country, showing her the parts of his land he loved best, the places where the light fell in particular ways at particular times, the creek in winter with ice at its edges, the view from the North Ridge that on clear days extended to a blue horizon that felt infinite. She came to know Tommy with a depth that went beyond teacher and student, came to understand the child he was and the man he was becoming, and she did not try to replace his mother, because she understood, with a precision that came from her own history of loss and reconstruction, that replacement was neither possible nor desirable. What she could offer was addition, more love, not different love. Tommy understood this at some level because he was that kind of child, and he met it with a quiet, open gratitude that broke her heart regularly in the very best way. Albert showed her, in small daily ways, the depth of what Tommy had begun to reveal to her that August afternoon on the main street. He was a man of profound actions and sparse words, who demonstrated care through presence and practical attention, who noticed things about her that no one had ever noticed before, and responded to those noticings with the kind of understated thoughtfulness that was more valuable than grand gestures. He ordered a specific medicine from San Antonio when she had a persistent cough in January without mentioning it until the package arrived, at which point he simply handed it to her with the information that he had read it was effective and hoped it helped. When she stayed at the school late on evenings before important lessons and came home tired, she would find wood already split and stacked on her porch, which she had never asked for and he had never commented on. She confronted him about it once in February, standing in her kitchen with snow on the ground outside and the stove going and the light warm. "You keep doing things," she said, "without telling me." He looked at her with slight wariness, wondering if he had overstepped. "I like to be useful," he said carefully. "I know," she said. "I am not criticizing. I am saying that you can also tell me when you have done something kind. You are allowed to take credit." He was quiet for a moment. "I do not do it for credit." "I know that too," she said, "but I would like to be able to thank you. I would like you to let me acknowledge what you do for me. Can you learn that?" He considered it with characteristic seriousness. "I expect I can," he said. "It may take time." "We have time," she said. He looked at her with the steady, warm certainty that was his particular form of romantic expression. "Yes," he said, "we do." They were married in March of 1883, when the first green was coming back to the hill country and the creek was running high with snowmelt from the north. The ceremony was at the church, conducted by Reverend Holt with the genuine warmth of a man who knew both families and understood what he was witnessing. The entire town came. All of Virginia's students sat in the front rows, with Tommy Barker in the very center wearing his best clothes and a look of proprietary satisfaction. Virginia wore a dress she had made herself from a pale blue wool that Mrs. Holt had helped her find, with her hair up in the way that Albert had once, with enormous difficulty and evident self-consciousness, told her he found particularly beautiful, a compliment she had treasured precisely because of the effort it had cost him. Albert wore his good dark suit and looked at her when she came down the aisle with that open, unguarded expression that was his greatest rarity and his greatest gift. Tommy stood beside his father during the vows, because that was where he wanted to be, and because it was right that he should be there. He was gaining a mother, not losing a father, and the three of them were becoming something together, a family that had been assembled by grief and stubbornness and secret rooftop repairs in the rain, and one small boy's perfectly timed disclosure. After the ceremony, at the celebration dinner at Oak's barn, which had been decorated again with the same communal enthusiasm as the harvest social, Albert danced with Virginia through 4 consecutive dances, and then stood beside her for the rest of the evening with his hand at her back, and she leaned very slightly into the warmth of his presence and felt, with a solidity and completeness that she had not felt about any place in her life before, that she was home. They went to the ranch as a family. Virginia had decided, after long and honest conversation with both Albert and Tommy, to continue teaching through the spring semester and to finish the school year properly before stepping back from the position. The school board would need to find her replacement, which she would help with. She had built something in that schoolhouse, and she wanted to leave it in good hands, not abandon it mid-semester out of personal circumstances. Albert had not only supported this decision but had been the one to articulate most clearly why she should not feel torn about it. "You started something," he had said. "You finish it. That is what you do." The simplicity and certainty of his endorsement had been more affirming than anything more elaborate could have been. She taught through May and helped hire her replacement, a young woman named Eleanor Price from Fredericksburg who had excellent qualifications and the right spirit for the work. And Virginia spent 2 weeks in June showing Eleanor the school, the system, the children, the rhythm of the days, handing over something she had built with genuine care for the future of it. At the ranch, life had its own rhythm, and Virginia learned it. She was not a passive partner in the household, which no one had expected her to be. She took on the management of the finances and the accounts with an efficiency that Albert had not anticipated, and that clearly delighted him, because it was something he had been managing alongside everything else and was not his strongest skill. She organized the kitchen garden and the preserved goods. She corresponded with a school in Austin about curriculum materials and maintained her connection to the education of the community through the school board, on which she now served as a parent representative rather than a teacher. Tommy thrived. Under Eleanor's capable instruction, he continued to develop his extraordinary aptitude, and at home, he had what he had not had for 4 years, which was a household with 2 parents in it, 2 people who moved through the daily life of the ranch with the particular efficiency of a partnership that had found its natural shape. Virginia and Albert did not agree on everything. They argued, sometimes sharply, and she had discovered that Albert in an argument was a formidable opponent because he did not raise his voice, but he was precise and persistent and never resorted to manipulation, only to evidence and logic, which meant she had to be fully intellectually engaged rather than emotionally deflecting, which was sometimes frustrating and always ultimately satisfying. He had learned, gradually, and with the determination he brought to everything, to tell her when he had done something kind. He did not always remember, but often enough he would say, with the slightly deliberate quality of a man practicing a new skill, "I oiled the hinges on the gate. They were sticking." Or, "I spoke to Doc Reardon about your question about the fever remedies. He said to send his notes." And she would thank him and mean it, and he would accept the thanks with a brief nod and a look that said he was beginning to understand the value of the exchange, not because it changed what he did or why he did it, but because it created the shared acknowledgement that two people in a genuine partnership needed. In late summer of 1883, Virginia told Albert she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening, on the porch, with the Texas sunset doing extraordinary things to the sky to the west, and he was quiet for long enough that she had a moment of irrational anxiety, which she managed with the discipline she always brought to irrational anxiety. Then he reached over and took her hand in both of his and held it with a firmness that was not pressure but steadiness, and when she looked at his face, it was doing the open, unguarded thing, the thing that was his rarest expression and his most true, and she understood that the quietness had not been reluctance but the particular silence of a man whose feeling was too large for words. "Are you pleased?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply, and then after a moment, "Yes, very much." Tommy was told the following morning at breakfast, and responded with a delight that was entirely unself-conscious, immediately declaring his intention to teach the baby to ride a horse, and then, upon reflection, also arithmetic, because he felt he had some skill in that area. Albert met Virginia's eyes over the top of Tommy's head with that quiet, warm amusement that was uniquely theirs, and she felt the warmth of it go through her like good medicine. The pregnancy was healthy, and the birth, in the spring of 1884, was hard but concluded well, attended by Doc Reardon and Mrs. Holt, both of whom pronounced the outcome satisfactory. Albert remained in the house through the whole of it, which was not universal among men of that era, and Virginia would remember for the rest of her life the specific quality of his presence during those long hours, steady and quiet and utterly reliable, there when she needed the anchor of a hand to hold and respectfully distant when she needed space, reading her with the same careful attention he brought to everything about her. They named the boy James, after Albert's father. Tommy declared James the best possible development of the year, and applied himself to the project of being a good elder brother with the same focused seriousness he brought to mathematics. James Albert Barker grew up knowing, from his earliest understanding, that he was the product of a love story. He knew this because his parents were not people who hid their affection for each other in the private and performance-oriented way that some couples of the era managed their relationships. They were not demonstrative in public in excessive ways. They were too private for that, but they were visibly and genuinely in a partnership, two people who liked each other deeply as well as loved each other, who talked and argued and laughed and worked side by side through the days with the particular quality of presence that characterized genuinely matched people. He knew the story of the roof, eventually. He heard it first from Tommy, who told it the way older siblings tell foundational family stories, with the dramatic instinct of someone who understands good narrative. He heard it again from his mother, who told it differently with the particular reflective quality of someone who still felt the emotional resonance of it across the years, and he heard it once from his father, who told it the shortest of all. "Your mother's roof was going to fail," Albert said, when James asked him about it at the age of 9. "I fixed it." "But why didn't you tell her?" James pressed. Albert was quiet for a moment. They were on the porch, the same porch where he had held Virginia's hand the evening she told him about the baby, the porch that had become the place where the most important conversations of their life together happened. The hill country evening was going deep and gold around them, because she needed to not need help, Albert said carefully, but she still needed help. Both things were true, so I found a way to honor both. James thought about this. "Is that love?" he asked. Albert looked at him with those dark eyes that had looked at Virginia with the same quality of attention since the moment on the schoolhouse porch in September of 1882. "That is one of the forms it takes," he said. "When you know someone well enough to know what they need even when they cannot ask for it, and you care enough about who they are that you give it in a way that does not cost them anything." James Barker carried this definition with him for the rest of his life, and told it to his own children, and they told it to theirs, and the story of the roof and the rain became one of those family stories that outlasts the people who lived it and becomes something larger, a philosophy, a practice, a way of understanding what love in its most functional and genuine form actually looks like. In the years that followed, Harrow Creek grew, as Texas towns grew in the last decades of the 19th century, and the Barker Ranch grew with it. By 1887, Albert had expanded further east, purchasing a neighboring property when its elderly owner retired and moved to live with family in San Antonio. Virginia, who had never entirely left education despite leaving the schoolhouse, had organized a small lending library out of their home that served the ranch families in the surrounding area, and was in correspondence with the state education board about curriculum standards that she believed needed improving. She had, in the steady and unremarkable way of capable people operating at full capacity, become a significant figure in the community's intellectual and civic life, not through ambition or calculation, but simply by being there, and being useful, and being too good at things to be ignored. Eleanor Price, her successor at the school, had become a genuine friend, and between them they had essentially run the educational affairs of the town for years, Eleanor from inside the school and Virginia from outside it, a partnership that the children benefited from enormously. Albert and Virginia had, by the time James was learning to ride his own horse under the combined supervision of his father and an 8-year-old Tommy, who took the responsibility extremely seriously, arrived at the kind of marriage that is rarely celebrated in songs or stories because it lacks dramatic torment, but is in truth the greatest success available to human beings. They were happy. Not in the breathless, crisis-fueled way of stories that need conflict to sustain their forward motion, but in the deep, warm, daily way of two people who chose well and knew it, and woke up every morning in the knowledge that they were exactly where they were supposed to be with exactly the right person. They had their difficulties, as all real lives do. There was a drought in 1886 that was financially damaging and personally exhausting, that required hard decisions and depleted reserves, and tested Albert's stoic composure in ways that Virginia witnessed clearly and supported through without drama. There was a year when Tommy, at 14, went through the particular suffering of adolescence with intensity, and redirected a fair amount of it at his father in the way that teenagers redirect suffering at the person they feel safest with. And that year was trying for everyone, but they came through it intact, and Tommy came out the other side closer to his father than he had been before, because Albert, with characteristic patience, had simply waited. There was an illness in 1888 that took Virginia to bed for 3 weeks with a fever that frightened everyone, including Doc Reardon, who did not frighten easily. Albert was present through all of it with the same unremarked, foundational constancy he brought to everything that mattered. He did not leave the house during the worst of it. He sat beside her when she slept, and he brought her water when she was awake, and he spoke to her in the low, careful voice that she loved, telling her about what was happening on the ranch, what James and Tommy were doing, small details of the world outside her sick room that kept her connected to the life waiting for her. When she recovered, fully and completely as the stubborn health she had always had eventually reasserted itself, he told her one evening, simply and without drama, that he had been more frightened during those 3 weeks than he had ever been about anything in his life. She had taken his face in her hands, the way he had taken hers that November day beside the woodpile, and she had told him that she was not going anywhere. "Good," he said. "You are supposed to say you were frightened too," she told him. "You already knew that," he said. "I need to hear it." "I know," he said. "I was frightened, very frightened, the most frightened I have been about anything." "Thank you," she said. He was learning. He was always learning, this man, this contained and careful and profoundly good man, learning the expressions and the words and the forms of emotional communication that had not come naturally to him, learning them the way he learned everything, with patient attention and genuine effort, because they mattered to her and she mattered to him, and that was sufficient reason for anything. The last years of the 1880s brought both Virginia and Albert into a fuller maturity, a settling into themselves, and their life that had the quality of good wine finding its character with time. Albert had gray at his temples now and lines at the corners of his eyes that Virginia found more attractive than she had any logical reason to. And she had the particular quality that some women develop in their late 30s, a settled, certain presence that is more compelling than youth's uncertain bloom. Tommy, at 17, was working the ranch alongside his father with a skill and dedication that made Albert quietly and profoundly proud, and was also, Virginia noted with the particular attention she always brought to the people she loved, showing the earliest signs of interest in the Miller family's eldest daughter, a sensible and bright girl named Clara, which was a development Virginia tracked with interest and discretion. James, at 5 and then 6 and then 7, was growing into himself with the combination of his parents' best qualities and some entirely his own. His mother's intellectual curiosity and verbal fluency, combined with his father's steady practicality and quiet emotional perceptiveness, a combination that suggested he was going to be a remarkable person if he got a chance to grow into it fully. In the autumn of 1889, Virginia discovered she was expecting again. She was 38 years old, which was not unusual for the era, but was the age at which one took such things seriously, and Doc Reardon was attentive and careful throughout. Albert was, if possible, even more present and attentive than he had been with James, which Virginia had not thought possible, and she told him one evening that he was going to wear a path in the floorboards walking back and forth checking on her. He smiled, the real smile. "Probably," he said, "the baby was a girl." They named her Caroline after Virginia's mother, and she arrived in April of 1890, healthy and vocal, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's definite expression. And Tommy, at 18, held his new sister with the practiced ease of a young man who had helped raise James, and announced that she was the finest baby he had ever seen, which James, at 6, disputed loudly on the grounds that Tommy had said the same thing about him. Albert stood in the doorway of the bedroom where Virginia lay propped against pillows with Caroline in the curve of her arm and watched his family with that open, unguarded expression that Virginia had learned to treasure, that rarest version of his face, the one that was all the way in, all the way present, not a wall in sight. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at Caroline with the same careful attention he looked at everything that mattered. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like you," Virginia said. "Both, perhaps," he said. "Both," she agreed. He reached over and touched Caroline's small hand, very gently, the same way he touched everything that was precious and could be damaged by carelessness. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around one of his. "Albert," Virginia said, "do you remember what Tommy told me about the roof?" He looked up at her. "I told him not to tell you." "I know," she said, "but I am glad he did." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with all that contained deep, steady warmth. "Are you?" "It changed everything," she said. "You were fixed in my mind as one kind of man, and then I found out you were entirely another, a better one, the best one I have met." "You had a low starting point with me," he said. "That is your fault," she said. "You could have been warmer from the beginning." "I could have," he said. "I should have. I was afraid. You have told me that." "I will tell you again," he said, "because it is true and because the things that are true and important deserve saying more than once. I was afraid. You arrived in my town and you were exactly the kind of person who frightens a man who has already lost someone and is trying not to. Someone who matters immediately, someone you cannot look at without knowing they matter." Virginia felt the familiar sting of tears. She did not manage them this time. She let them come because they were the right kind, the kind that come when someone says something so precisely true that your body has to respond to it. "And now," she said, "and now I am not afraid," he said. "I have not been afraid for a long time." "What are you now?" she asked. He looked at her and at Caroline, and toward the door where they could hear James and Tommy's voices in the hallway, bickering amiably about something. And he looked back at Virginia with those dark eyes that had first looked at her in April of 1882 with wariness and something much warmer underneath it. And he said, in the quiet, certain voice that was entirely and specifically his, "Grateful." She reached up and touched his face. He turned slightly into her hand with the same quality of trust she had seen him show almost nowhere else, and Caroline made a small sleeping sound between them, and outside the window the Texas spring was beginning in earnest, green and bright, and going on in all directions toward the horizon and beyond. The roof, 20 years later, was entirely solid. Albert had replaced it properly in 1885, new timber and new shingles from top to bottom, after they had moved into the ranch house, and Virginia's rented house had been taken over by the new schoolteacher. It was a good roof. It kept out the worst of what the Texas sky could throw at it. Albert had built it to last. He built everything to last. That was the thing about Albert Barker that Virginia Dugan had needed Tommy to tell her before she could see it, before her own defenses had allowed her to see it. He was a man who built things to last. He repaired what was damaged. He strengthened what was weak. He did this quietly, without ceremony, in the rain if necessary, at night if necessary, without asking for acknowledgement or generating obligation. He had done it with her. He had, from the very beginning, understood that she was a woman of exceptional capability and genuine fragility, of high walls and deep need, of fierce independence and profound hunger for the kind of love that respected who she was rather than requiring her to be other than she was. He had seen all of this, and he had been frightened by how much he saw, and he had managed his fear very badly for several months, and then he had been corrected, partially by a 7-year-old who could not stand for things to be complicated when they did not need to be, and he had spent the rest of his life making it right with her in all the small daily ways that right gets made. Virginia Dugan Barker grew old in the hill country of Texas, in the house on the Barker Ranch, with the man she had almost entirely misunderstood and then learned entirely, in the life she had come west to build without knowing yet exactly what it would look like. She was, at every age, the most capable person in most rooms she entered, and she was never again, after September of 1882, the person who needed to prove it to herself. She knew what she was worth. She had a man who had climbed on her roof in the rain to tell her so before he had said a single word about it. She had needed a boy to tell her. She was grateful for it every day for the rest of her life.